Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to UCL. A particular welcome to Claire's family. If you turn out in numbers like this often, can we invite you to everything we organise? And you can come and swell the numbers. It's fabulous to see you. You're really, really welcome. My name's Ben Page, and pleased to welcome everybody to this, our inaugural Claire Dwyer Memorial Lecture this afternoon. First, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Then I'm going to say a few words about Claire and her legacy and how we're keeping it alive. And then I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk for about 45 minutes about her research, and then open the floor for questions. And a couple of bits of housekeeping. There's bathrooms, I think, on this level, on this floor, for both genders. And should there be a fire alarm, you go up and out the way you came in, and then we muster around the back of this building. There won't be, but you know, we have to say these things. Good. All right. So Sarah Holloway is Professor of Social and Cultural Geography at the University of Loughborough. Was a student at the University of Sheffield, where she wrote a PhD on space, place, and the geographies of childcare. And throughout her career, she's pursued twin interests in the geographies of children, youth and families, and geographies of social difference. Through her extensive research, she's become one of the most well-known thinkers in the subdiscipline of children's geography, and her empirical work on enrichment activities for children, the changing nature of play, parenting education, and most recently on private tuition, has explored the way in which social processes shape education and how this is experienced, embraced, and contested by educators, which seems appropriate at the moment. Over and above her academic reputation, we asked Sarah to give this lecture for a number of reasons. Claire was a feminist, and Paul suggested, and we agreed, that our first speaker should be someone who shares those values and came from the same political and intellectual tradition. Sarah also shares Claire's concerns with research on social geographical questions of inequality and fairness, particularly in relation to issues of class as well as gender. But, this is our clicker, isn't it? Yeah. Which one?
Left or right.
But primarily, we thought of Sarah because of the book Geographies of Femininities, on which Sarah collaborated with Claire, as well as Fiona Smith and Nina Laurie. And the magnificent photo on the front of this book was contributed, I think, by Fiona from her research in East Germany. The genesis of that book lay in an earlier volume, Feminist Geographies, Explorations in Diversity and Difference, which had been written through a large-scale collaboration at the RGS Women and Geography Study Group, which was published in 1997. Sarah, Nina, Fiona, and Claire were all contributors to that volume, all finishing their PhDs and all starting their first academic appointments. And they discovered shared interests in femininity, and that's what led to their collaboration together. And the book has a really interesting structure with substantive empirical chapters based on their doctoral work in London, Sheffield, Leipzig, and Lima, and equally substantive synthesizing chapters as they explored common themes in their work. So Sarah, we're really grateful to you for coming today. I want now to turn too briefly perhaps to Claire's legacy of 24 years of work at UCL, starting as a 3-year fixed-term lecturer on a salary of £15,000 a year in 1995. Some of Claire's legacies are institutional, her work evolving the Migration Research Unit, including launching a widely downloaded series of working papers, establishing the master's degree in global migration, her role in establishing the London Migration Research Group with colleagues at SOAS and LSE, her incredible record as a PhD supervisor and examiner, her time as the department's graduate tutor, which saw the formal establishment of doctoral training classes within the department. Claire was also highly active across UCL, for example, in the Grand Challenges, the UCL Grand Challenges program, doing great work publicizing our department at university level. And she used those contacts to enable our master's students to run regular conferences too. Claire had a reputation as a hugely popular teacher within the department at all levels, not because she was a pushover, she had really high standards, but because she exuded enthusiasm about her topics, and they were topics that students could relate to and whose significance students appreciated. One of my roles in recent years has been to help allocate dissertation supervisors, and foolishly, perhaps, we let students bid for their preferred supervisor. And in many years, Claire was the most popular choice, with far more students hoping she would supervise their work than she had capacity for. We think it's a wonderful legacy that since 2019, and through the generosity of her family, we've been able to award a Claire Dwyer Undergraduate Dissertation Prize in Social and Cultural Geography for a dissertation that we think Claire would have liked. That's not a well-known kind of set of criteria for doing any work, but that's how we do it. And the work of the three winners, Gillian Lee, Heather Goldring, and Manon Davies-Lewis, is available for everyone to have a look at after the lecture in the reception. But apart from these sort of institutional legacies, there's something much more significant, which is about Claire's spirit, which remains very present in this department. Claire's enthusiasm for creativity, for example, is something that we try to keep alive. Claire worked with photographers, dramatists, artists, poets, and writers. It was integral to her research and to her teaching, and it contributed to the life in our department. One year she enrolled me in work with the education team at the Donmar Warehouse, and I really treasure the memories of working with her in the theatre and with a number of secondary schools on new pieces that those students were creating based on the research that we'd done about home and mobility. Many other colleagues were also involved with creative writing projects and other creative activities with Claire. And that emphasis on bringing creativity into the department is continued in the present with work by Tom and Kaz and Tariq and others on music, dance and art. Some of Nathaniel's work is on display in the reception, but it was Claire who blazed this trail. And a second way we try to keep Claire's spirit alive in the department is through remembering her conviviality and collegiality. She was great at getting people involved in stuff, even when they didn't think they necessarily wanted to be. For many of us, she was the sympathetic colleague you turned to when you were fed up. She made time to listen to colleagues patiently. And in my experience, she dispensed wisdom that could be clear and direct, but which was invariably wise. I really miss having Claire as a colleague, but we do seek to keep her values, her creativity, and her collegiality alive. And in relation to that last point, can I take this opportunity to make sure that you all know you're invited to our reception just along the corridor after Sarah's lecture. So I'm now going to hand over to Sarah and wrestle a little bit with IT first.
Thank you.
All good?
Yeah, good. Hi, thank you. So I'm going to give a talk today that's about my research because that's what I've been asked to do. I just wanted to emphasise before I do though, it's been undertaken jointly with Dr. Helena Pimlett-Wilson and Dr. Sam Hewell as well, because it's a jointly funded piece of work through the Leverhulme Trust, and it's about geographies of private tuition. But before I started, I just wanted to follow on from what Ben's been saying. I first met Claire, well, I think the thing is, Claire to you is your family. She's your mum or your wife or your daughter. And to you people at UCL, she's your colleague of many years, but she was also something to those of us outside of UCL, outside of her family, but were part of the wider geographic community. And I first met her at an RGS session. They had Women in Geography Study Group reception, because in those days when you went to the conference, it was tremendously male dominated and you would be a woman walking into a room full of men. So they ran sessions that women could go along, meet another woman and frankly make your little gang so you knew some people. Claire was fantastic at that. There was a room there were drinks on the table, everyone was stood there kind of quietly. Claire comes in and walks around the room and goes, hello, my name's Claire, who are you? What do you do? Hello, my name's Claire, who are you? What do you do? So that sense of conviviality and collegiality we've just been talking about had a massive impact on those kind of gatherings. and creating a network of women in geography and making geography a nicer place for my generation of women to be. Because we were all going back to departments where we were maybe the woman or maybe one or two women, and it gave us a sense of belonging in the discipline. So that's kind of why I got the Women in Geography Study Group on there. And we did write together, as you said, and we went on and wrote a book together, which was a lovely intellectual experience. And we didn't have Zooms, that involved lots of weekends at other people's houses in a far more convivial fashion than it might be done now. But it gave a kind of a longer intellectual tradition and linkage with her as well. So we didn't do exactly the same research, that was the point. We did subtly different things, but it was a coming together and a meeting of minds, which was why I valued her, as well as her friendship, but her intellectual contribution. And before I came, one of my colleagues also asked me to say something. So a younger colleague, Professor Sarah Mills, met Claire at a conference when she was a PhD student. Claire was tremendously supportive of her work on Muslim scouting. I think scouting was something those two have in common, an interest in it. But she wanted me to say how much she encouraged postgrads in the wider community as well. So it wasn't just my generation of women she made a difference to. It was women in the wider intellectual community. This is a slide from one of our first year lectures where Claire's work is still taught. So she's having an intellectual input on the curriculum for undergraduates in other departments as well. So her work continues through the eyes and voices of others. So that's my little bit. Sorry, I got through that, so that was fine. But I've been asked to talk about research and to talk about something. Okay, I don't know what you're doing to the. I can do it on here though. No, I absolutely can't. The arrows don't work. Yeah, working. So I'm interested, as has been said, in geographies of education. It's a field that's developed in kind of in Anglophone geography since 1960s, 70s. Claire's work in geographies of education was quite early. It's really blossomed in the 21st century, and it looks at all sorts of spheres of education. It looks at everything from preschool through schooling into geographies of higher education. The particular area I'm interested in at the moment is supplementary education. And I don't mean supplementary education in the kind of 1960s sense of Black supplementary schooling to help children resist racist schooling and learn kind of Black history alongside maths and English skills. I mean supplementary education in the sense of additional education outside of school that is paid for by parents in order to improve children's educational performance within schools. So I'm talking about private tuition, individual one-to-one tutors, and kind of learning centres like this. And that hasn't been in the literature on geographies of education. So part of our purpose in this research is to increase the focal reach of geographies of education, to include that. We think it's an important form of educational provision. We think it's important because it's increasing. Around 25% of young people, or children aged 11 to 16 in the English state education system have used some form of private tuition by the time they're in secondary schools. So I'm not saying they're using it every day of every week, but that it's a form of tuition that's there and it's growing over time. We can trace its increases over time. It's very socially differentiated. It's unsurprisingly used more by richer people because you have to pay for it. It's interesting in terms of its ethnic variation, in that usage rates are twice as high amongst Black and Asian families than they are of white families. So the figures are around mid-40s for Black and Asian families who use state education, have used some private tuition by the time their kids are 11 to 16, and it's low 20s for white families. It's not gendered, which is interesting, but it does vary with space. A lot higher in London, average rates kind of through the Midlands, and much lower rates in the north of England. So we think it's interesting because it's growing. We think it's interesting because it's socially and spatially differentiated. And it's important because it's literally about improving children's attainment, which is getting them qualifications and getting them into work. So it has longer term impacts on children's lives. So we're trying to increase the focus on this. And in doing so, we're academics. So we're also interested in how geographical thinking might contribute to debates about the relationships between home and school. So between, say, parenting cultures and the way children are educated and the way they experience the educational system. So it's both an empirical interest and a kind of conceptual interest for us. So I'll just say a little bit about the background literature. It's a very traditionally structured presentation. We're going to give a bit of the background literature. I'll give you the methods, and I'm going to go through 3 research aims. So Geographies of Education is theoretically very eclectic. It's got people who've come in from all sorts of different branches of geography and from different theoretical traditions. This particular piece of work draws quite strongly on Bourdieu and traditions that have followed him. And Bourdieu's arguments were that parents, so parenting cultures, the parents of the ruling class in his terms, give children the linguistic and cultural competence to go to school and make the best of it, that he calls that the instruments of appropriation. He gives middle-class parents, he is arguing, are giving children the skills to do well out of education and therefore benefit in the longer term through the appreciation of kind of this institutionalized form of cultural capital, such as educational qualifications. And in doing so, he doesn't go through a purely individualist or a purely structuralist approach. He's very much interested in how people's dispositions, so their habitus, their kind of sense of ideas, their dispositions, their wants and desires, intersect with their capital, whether that be cultural, social, or economic. But that intersection of what you want to do and what you've got the power to do always takes place in a particular field or environment, a social field or an environmental context. And he's arguing it's that intersection, or he does it as an equation, but the intersection of your desires, your capital, and the field you're in that leads to different social practices. And it's parenting practices we're particularly interested in relation to private tuition. Why are parents doing what they're doing with their children? Now, his work has travelled and it's been used by lots of different people in lots of sometimes contradictory ways. But we're interested in the work of Leroux, who has built on homeschool ethnographies to look at parenting cultures and how what parents do in the home can impact on children's experiences in education. And she draws a binary division between middle-class concerted cultivation and working-class natural growth. So in terms of middle-class concerted cultivation, she's arguing middle-class parents do things like extracurricular activities with their children, verbal reasoning with their children, they get involved in school and become school governors and volunteer, those kind of things. And that those activities give children a range of soft skills that are then useful in helping them get the best out of school, soft skills that are going to be useful in the labour market, and give them an emerging sense of entitlement as well. She argues, by contrast, working class parents have been more interested in what she calls natural growth, the accomplishment of natural growth. So they ensure that children are safe, fed and loved, and that this is better in some ways in that they have stronger family relationships, stronger extended family relationships, but it also constrains their engagement with schools because they haven't learned the same soft skills that have been taught to the middle class children. So there's that kind of literature sat there in the background. Okay, and then there's been new ways of thinking added to this, as there always are. In terms of class, this approach has been argued to be too binary, and that it's not just a cultural difference between parents, that financial differences might make a difference to how parents parent. Can you afford all these clubs and activities? It's also been criticized, or actually this is social change. that there are increasing this intensification of parenting, this intensification of mothering, where we do more with children. The arguments are that's actually spreading through all class groups at the moment. So that binary isn't necessarily there, but also that it misses out intensive forms of mothering within low-income groups. For example, the way people might ensure their children have access to material goods so they can fit in. That can be an intensive form of mothering that's very important for ensuring social inclusion for your child. So there are arguments that, yes, that class distinction matters, but that we need to think, is it that strong anymore? Is it always like that? Are there differences within classes? Are there sometimes similarities between classes? The picture is never as simple as kind of nice, easy concepts might suggest. Leroux was interesting because she argued these differences in parenting were shaped by class, but not by race. And that's been widely subject to critique. There's been quite a lot of quantitative studies that look at the differences in what parents do. So how many parents of different ethnicities are doing activities with their children. It's also looked at how the same inputs can have differentiated outputs because of structural racism. So Black mothers who volunteer in schools and white mothers who volunteer in schools, the white mothers volunteering increases teacher views of the competence of the child. That does not happen when Black mothers volunteer in schools, despite the fact they're stratified for their educational backgrounds, etc. So it's pointing out that sometimes the same activities, because of structural racism, might have different outcomes. There's been qualitative work as well, looking at growth of Black middle class, for example, and the intersections of class and race there. Yeah, and there's just been some sense in which Leroux, people have been rereading Leroux on the basis of critical race theory and going, actually, she missed quite a lot of racial processes in there. So there's an argument we need to pay more attention to class, more attention to race, and obviously I'm a geographer, so I'm going to say we ought to pay more attention to place as well. And the arguments here really is that quite a lot of cultural capital research has been ripped out of its contextual context. So Bourdieu, in that equation I was showing you, was arguing that your dispositions and your capitals intersect in the context of a particular field, but the emphasis on field has been downplayed, and that's one of the things we're trying to do in this paper, is re-emphasize the importance of field. So at the global scale, the country you're in matters, the educational landscape matters to how you acquire your dispositions, but also whether you can act on your cultural capital in that, or your economic capital, whichever type of capital in that landscape. So different education systems require different things of parents. So it matters kind of where you are in the globe. At other scales, it also matters though. It matters in the neighbourhood, kind of where you are. Different neighbourhoods have different resources that you can draw on. They have different educational opportunities available. They've got a different social makeup. All of those things can lead to different moral geographies about how parenting ought to be done, different pressures placed on parents to behave in different ways. So we argue there's kind of multi-scalar levels in which place can matter into how parents think about their children's education and how they can act on their dispositions because of the fields in which they find themselves. So we'd argue multi-scalar research is also important. So where we've got to then is a set of aims, and I'm going to go through 3 of them in the findings as well. So firstly, we want to look at how the multi-scalar educational field ferments private tuition use. I said it's rising in England, so why is it going up? What's happening? We are then going to look at firstly middle class, and then working class families, to look at how their habitus, how their dispositions, and how their capitals come together in particular places. And we're differentiating them into 3 categories. Asian families, Black families and white families, because those categories reflect the categories done in earlier statistical work and how those statistics were originally collected. We've also done work with mixed race families. There isn't a mixed race section here because when we analysed the data from mixed race families, they didn't all fit one pattern or another. They were talking through their experiences in relation to Asian families, Black families or white families. So we put them in kind of where they're talking about. So there's a very broad brush categories and yeah, it's a first take on it. I think there's much more work to be done in breaking them down, but I'll show that on the way through. So those are the three things I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the geography of it. I'm going to look at middle class families, and then I'm going to look at working class families. And just in terms of the studies, I say it's we've done three, it's an English case study, but we've worked in three areas. London, because it's got the most buoyant market, shall we say. East Midlands has got an average market and Northwest is lowest. The stats on London come out about 44% of children have had some form of private tuition, whereas in the Northwest it's 13.5%, so they're quite different. Within each region, we've interviewed 20 families with a child between 12 and 18 in state education. And we have interviewed the parents and the children. I'm only talking about the parents today. And it's a purposive sample. So we've got mostly parents who've used private tuition, but some that haven't. And then we've got every kind of combination of people with different class and ethnic groupings. In terms of ethics, it obviously involves human subjects and children under 18. So we've been through full ethical approval. And the analysis is from the interview transcripts, which we've coded in vivo. So those are our methods then. So what about our findings? So I'm said I'm a geographer and that the place side of things interests me. So how does place matter in all of this? Well, to start with, we do think that the national picture does have a big impact. So when we talk to parents about how important education is, the answer was generally very. And there was a real emphasis that qualifications mattered and a sense of jeopardy and concern and worry about what might happen if your children didn't achieve the qualifications required. So this is evident in the first quote on the slide from Amira saying, well, if her daughter hasn't had the qualifications, she can't have the good job and her future will be ruined. It's a real sense of jeopardy that we have to help them get here. And it's expressed at different levels of attainment. So the second two quotes are on there from working class women in the East Midlands. And they're talking about GCSE maths and English, and they're talking about the importance of getting those, both for going on to post-16, because if you haven't got that, you're not, but also that that's really crucial for getting into a job. You're not going to be able to get a job if you haven't got your maths and your English. But I could have put quotes on there for other people who had higher attaining children, talking about finessing their A-level results, because in a massified higher education system, you want your child to get into the best university, so the best results kind of are a matter in that process. So there's a national emphasis on qualifications, but those qualifications are to be achieved in a marketized and highly unequal education system. So parents think it matters, but they're not given a level playing field. So what do? Well, they're trying to work the system to get the best out of it for their child. So the first chap here, who's a middle class Black father from London, he's saying, well, not everybody can afford private schooling. So he's out of the market for private schooling. He's not rich enough for that. So how would you try and get that edge for your kids anyway? Well, that's why we're using private tuition. We know our kids aren't getting what other people's children are getting, so we're trying to replace it. So that's one kind of logic parents were using. Ria she's in the area of the Northwest that's got grammar schools. And so equally using private tutoring to try and get your child well advanced in the 11 plus was important. She argued because if you get into grammar school, you're sort of set for life. So they are people using private tuition to help their children compete to get the best position in the education system. But any competition has winners and losers. So there are also people who've lost the competition for the best places. And the lady at the bottom is saying, well, that's effectively why she's then using private tuition. Her child is in a school that's graded, requires improvement. And now we can all debate Ofsted and the merits of those gradings, but it did shape her interpretation of that school, and her experience of the school was that she felt she needed to do more. So she was paying money she didn't have to try and help her child in the context of feeling like she wasn't in a good school, in her view. So we've got this national picture where qualifications matter, but we've got a really unequal system. So parents are fighting effectively to try and get the best for their children. But it's interesting that the marketisation of schooling and the kind of competition level of schooling even comes down to daily practices in school that then impact upon what people are doing in the home. So the practice of setting, as this lady says, was a major worry. Okay, so this lady's daughter is having tuition in maths and English and science because all three were setted in this academy school. So it's comprehensive academy school, but it's very competitive, and they move children up and down between sets at the end of every half term. So they were really worried about asking too many questions in case they didn't look very bright, but there were assessments all the time. And so they were worried about always getting a good score in the assessments in case they were then demoted. So there's potential to move up and down, she's arguing. It wasn't just about the setting, it was also, we had a lot of people talking about target grades. So schools are required to give children a target grade, and if they're not meeting it, there was a great sense of responsibilization from the children that they should be meeting it. They weren't doing well as expected of them, and the parents were turning to private tuition there as well, because their kids were saying, I don't know how to do this, I'm not doing very well, and turning to private tutoring was one way they sought to alleviate that pressure within their families. So kind of the national context matters, kind of parts of our national education system matter. But I've just told you there's a geography to private tuition that is more buoyant in London than it is in the Northwest. Actually, the region did not turn out to be a useful geographical space for us because there's so much variation within those regions. That's not how parents experienced it. We've basically got some regions that have got lots of high tuition neighbourhoods within them and fewer low tuition neighbourhoods, and other regions have got a lot of low tuition neighbourhoods, but still some high tuition neighbourhoods. But it was the neighbourhood level parents were experiencing the tuition market. It wasn't as the Northwest, it was people around here where I live kind of level. And people in high tuition neighbourhoods just talked about how normal it was to have a tutor in their area. So I haven't put this one on the slide, but it's relatively easy to come by a tutor in my area of London. It's just a very normal thing for my area. So parents were exposed to tuition through parenting networks, through children's peer groups, through adverts coming through their door, kind of like just free leaflet drops, from seeing high street tuition businesses. And so for these parents, it became an unremarkable feature of life. It was really normalised. And what I'm trying to do in this quote is pick out, well, one of the ways, we'll come on to another one in a minute, in which this process was normalised. How did it come to be seen so normal? Well, one is then through peer pressure between parents. So this chap's in the Northwest, in an area where there's grammar schools, and he talks about how the fact if you didn't have a tutor for your child when the 11 plus was coming up, you were seen to not be doing the best for your child. So it was tantamount to child abuse if you haven't got a tutor, which obviously it's not tantamount to child abuse, but we see the power of the deconstruction really that we see in government policy, that actually parents have got a role to play. Parents should be supporting children's education. Parents should be acting as people who are doing the best and working the system for their children. It was being accepted by parents that they needed to navigate this unequal system for their children. So one thing was then it became pressure. Everyone else was doing it, so you felt you had to. But it was also about how neighbourhoods afforded possibilities to people. So Paminda in this one here is saying, well, she used to think private tuition was just for like really rich posh people. But then when she moved to East London into a predominantly Asian area, it was just everywhere. So it was every cluster of shops would have a tuition centre. She'd get these leaflets through her door. And she's saying her perception has changed from being in that type of neighbourhood. And she's then gone into doing this with her children. So it is everywhere. It seems like a possibility for her. And that shapes her practices. In that sense, we can see how the field is also shaping the emergence of her dispositions, that she wants to do it because she can see it around her. And it really contrasts with Kerry from the Northwest. She was living in a smaller town in the Northwest. And she's saying it didn't cross her mind. She thought tuition was something she used in college. I think she might have heard of it in the context of tuition fees. It wasn't clear. She basically didn't know what it was. It was lovely, happy to talk to us, but you kind of think, oh, I've done my consent forms, but you mustn't have understood them. Anyway, so, but she just didn't know. And I'm not laughing at her because of that. It's just that wasn't at all part of the culture in this small northwestern town. Nobody used this. So the neighbourhood has got an impact on people's knowledges and therefore their dispositions and their practices. Yeah, so what I mean then by geography, why we think a multi-scalar analysis is important, is we are saying neighbourhood matters, but that's set within this national emphasis on qualifications. It's set within these nationally unequal school markets, and that's shaping responsibilized parents' kind of attitudes and practices towards private tuition. So we can see how the context is driving the tuition market. Okay. We then have a group of middle-class parents, and middle-class parents on average use private tuition more, and Asian parents use private tuition the most. It's only a tiny bit more than Black middle-class parents. And what we see in what the middle-class Asian parents were telling us was the importance of both recent and historic migration. So Vera is a migrant, so first generation migrant, and she's talking about how her upbringing, she's Chinese, was shaped her attitudes to private tuition and how she sees it in this country. So when they go to Kumon, which is group tuition, 80% of the parents are Indian or Chinese or Asian background. The reason is in China or India, they're very competitive nations. Not that you're born competitive, but society makes you competitive. If the government doesn't look after you, you have to look after yourself. And you pretty much either suffer when you go to tuition when you're young to get somewhere, or you're going to suffer when you're old because you aren't going to be able to look after yourself. So she's talking about how growing up in a political economy without a fully robust welfare state, not that we've got one, but how that impacts on her attitudes to using private tuition. And that was in the case of people who are relatively recent migrants, and it endured post-migration. So similarly, I haven't put a quote on here, but from Kamal Vara, she talked about, yes, well, obviously I've done this in India and I was brought up, so I'm doing this with my children now. And I know the British people think there's something called too much pressure. I've not heard of that till I came here. I know the British people think that this is something I brought with me, but it wasn't just cultural. She was using it because she wanted her children to excel in competitive exams. She wanted them to excel in competitive labour markets. And that was the way she had successfully herself managed to do that. What we got from British Asian parents is a different response, and it was about how they needed to escape the hardship, really, of their migrant parents' working lives through education. They didn't have support at that time, so they're talking about growing up as children of migrants. They didn't have support, and they just want to kind of write that for their children. So this woman's saying she wants to throw everything she can at her children in order to help them. So there's a long shadow of migration in shaping people's dispositions. These attitudes are also reproduced through local, and I kind of mean British, racialised social capital. So Kamal Vara, who was very happy to use private tuition, talked about the excellent resource her Indian community network was in helping her find tutors. She just put something out on WhatsApp, people would tell her who to go to, and that was really useful. But obviously not everybody feels like that. And Leela there is saying, well, actually, she's had a lot of pressure. She's had a lot of pressure from family. She's had a lot of pressure from Asian friends because she wasn't choosing to use the level of private tuition that other people around her were. So I'm not trying to say everybody in these different groups as we go through agree with her. They don't, but they both talked about the level of knowledge about private tuition in that within Asian middle class communities, and that was a resource or a pressure to make you go down that route. And there was a lot of discussion about Asian stereotypes because all the researchers are white, and you'll see it in the way you'll see that come through in the quotes, the way they talk about white people to us, but you need to understand that's the researcher they're being faced with is white. There was a lot of talk about Asian stereotypes saying, well, I don't just want them to go into medicine, I want them to do whatever they want to do, as long as they're successful. For me, it can be in any field, as long as they're successful. And what we got from a variety of people really was this sense of pride. So yes, white people would probably want them to be more happy, whereas I want them to be happy but ambitious. Even where people were talking down stereotypes about Asian focus on medicine or engineering or what have you, there was still a sense of pride that these parents were ambitious for their children's future. Right. Those experiences were different to the Black middle class families. The Black middle class families were even more mixed, and lots of Black middle class families that we talked to seemed to be, well, were first generation middle class and didn't necessarily identify as middle class. So this lady, because of her position in education, is definitely NSEC 1 in terms of government classification. So she is middle class in terms of employment. We also looked at where people were living. Her ACORN score puts her in ethnically diverse social flats, I think. I'd have to quickly read my, ethnically deprived and ethnically diverse flats is her ACORN score. And she talks in this about she's living in a social housing place, so she doesn't see herself as middle class, despite her job. Her son's now at university, but she definitely sees education as a class project and a racialized class project, because that's how Black people are going to advance. And that's why she cares so much about education, because that is the route out of poverty, and that is the route to success for your child. So discussion about it as a class project of transformation was stronger amongst the Black middle class families than the Asian ones. And it, as I say, it is seen as a racialized class project. So Diane Thomas is Black British, and she followed her Black African friend into using private tuition because she's trying to help her child navigate a racist landscape. So I'm saying this isn't like Black supplementary schooling where you learn Black history as well as maths and English. This is literally private tuition where you're going to like improve your GCSE scores, improve your A-level scores. But she's doing it for a very clearly racialized reason, in that her children are experiencing racial stereotyping at school. You know, why you encourage boys, you know, why so many Black boys discouraged from academia and into sports. She wants him to have these qualifications because she thinks he's going to be disadvantaged in the labour market. And that idea of equalisation is also coming through with parents of girls. as this lady's saying, it's still a very racist and discriminative society. We talk about this in terms of the Black Lives Matters movement. Sorry, I'm slurring the words. But tuition puts you on a par. It puts you on the same level playing field as the white British. So it's very much a racialized class project to try and ensure your children can navigate racist Britain. Right. So their pictures, I say it was varied, but the pictures are different. When we come to the white middle class parents, these were the only group who were not necessarily totally positive about education, in the sense they were very clear to say they weren't pushy parents. The number of times the phrase pushy parent came in, as in I'm not one, was large. So this woman saying, well, we support education, we encourage education, but not in a pushy way, other people being more pushy than us, we're not pressured. We want them to be happy first, but then do what they love for their career. So there was a different set or a different way of talking about it, and it was about not being too pushy, not just focusing on education. And I think we can read into this the degrees of, different degrees actually, of white privilege experienced by this group. So the first mother's saying, oh, I haven't felt the need to use a tutor. Imogen's never needed extra input. You know, you can always make your child better. She's not an A-star student. I appreciate that, but you have to think, can you afford it? Well, we asked her if she could afford it, and she said, yes, she could. So for her, it wasn't actually really money, but she doesn't feel the need to make her daughter an A-star student. And that was absolutely not what was coming through from the Black families going, well, you have to be the best, so there can be no excuse for not giving your kids a job. In the interview, they can't just go, oh, you haven't got the grades, so we'll have that white person. You have to be the best you can be, so you're not discriminated against. Her white privilege is, oh, an A-star. It's all, you know, as you're doing well, you don't need to do better. And so their white privilege was allowing them to also focus on a rounded sense of childhood, getting soft skills through playing sports, etc. This lady is less economically well off than this one. She's still in the middle class work, but hasn't got as much money. And she does have to make a choice between sport or tutoring. And I'm not saying every white person chooses sport. There is difference in our sample. We did talk to some white people who used tutoring when they felt pressure to do so, but she chooses sport. And we did not meet Asian and Black families who were choosing sport to the same extent that white parents were. So this notion of a rounded childhood, I think, comes from the fact that these parents don't feel under quite the same level of pressure about every kind of part of achievement. So it is privilege, though there's various degrees of it, because there's still variation within the middle class in terms of income. Right, I'm nearly there, I'll be quick, don't worry. So we've got three groups then: working class white parents, or three groups of working class parents. Working class white parents, it's very similar in the way they talked about education. In the sense of not being a pushy parent. This lady's saying, oh, education is important, but it's not the be all and end all. It's not everything that makes you a whole person. It's not necessarily the most important priority. So she cared. She went to the school. She talked to kids about education. She looked at tuition, which she couldn't afford, and her daughter wouldn't go to because she didn't know anybody doing anything like that. But she cared, but it wasn't the top priority. But white working class are just as differentiated as all these groups. And so there were people within the white working class who were contesting class, traditional class and racialized practices. And they were clear, they kind of knew that is what they were doing. They knew they were breaking the rules in the sense of, oh, we don't normally push our kids, but set these sights higher. I don't think that's a bad thing to say. She knew she was contesting the rules in the community around her. But this was the only group then that kind of kept private tuition a bit quieter, partly because of embarrassment, you needed it, but also because, as this lady's then, people think you're a swot then, that's how you get labelled. And we did not have any other ethnic groups or even any other class groups worry about this labelling of being seen to try. Okay, that was seen as perfectly acceptable in other groups. The Black working class parents were similar to their middle class peers. So again, we see the importance of migration as well as local social capital. So this one was talking about how she was a child migrant. She didn't have what she needed in terms of support. So she wants to give her children kind of the support she didn't have. And we also see the social capital line. You know, you so brag when your kids do well. Everybody knows who's in the top set. Everybody knows who's in the bottom set. So those practices within schools come out within communities and shape how parents are feeling, because everybody knows how their child is doing and what's going on. So still a high value placed on education, still a lot of knowledge about it within the community. The differences here are about the ability to pay. So we've got people talking about how important education is. The most important thing for my son to progress in this country is for him to excel in education, to leave employers no choice but to employ him. But that chap couldn't afford it. This man is paying for it in very difficult circumstances. So I sacrifice, or she, that's his daughter, sacrifices now, she can do better. I leave my needs behind. In fact, we had asylum seekers who were feeding their children from food banks and using very limited income on private tuition. So people making levels of sacrifice, not kind of conceptualized by the middle class parents we were talking about a moment ago. And the working class Asian parents, very, very similar to their middle class peers. So again, this is a woman talking about how the attitudes to education have come with migrants, in this case from India. They bring these ideas about tuition centres. That's when this tuition centre set up, and now it's a normal thing in our community. She's British Asian, but she's talking about how migrants have bought the tuition centres with her. And again, people talking about them not having had support with homework because their parents weren't able to engage with the education system, now wanting to give it to their children. But the difference is the money. So culturally, very little difference, but money is the barrier. So Gunjita here is saying she really values education. She thinks it's good for her kids' jobs, it's good for their marriage prospects, it's good for their family honour. She was arguing it really matters how well her kids do. She can't possibly afford private tuition. Nobody uses it in her area. It's unknown in her area. So she's arguing we need better schools, not private tuition. She is excluded from that system. So in conclusion then, well, first thing then was we just think these processes, these practices, these businesses are out there. So it is something that geographers kind of ought to be studying, and we ought to be looking at the relationship between kind of educational practices, whether they're schools or private tuition businesses, and the way they intersect with family lives. So trying to expand the focal reach of geographies of education to include it. And it makes three contributions conceptually, we think. Firstly, we do think multi-scalar analysis matters. The national field, what our education systems like mattered here, the neighbourhood culture mattered, and both current and history of global mobility also mattered in shaping people's dispositions towards private tuition. So it shapes people's attitudes. And this impact of these multi-scalar processes shaping people's dispositions, we think matters when we're looking at racialized parenting cultures. Well, I don't want to argue those cultures are simply cultural. What I'm arguing are they're socially and spatially contingent practices. They're shaped by the field you find yourself in. They emerge out of global migration. They emerge out of structural racism in Britain. They emerge out of your neighbourhood culture and what people know around you. So that those wider processes around people are shaping their dispositions and shape their capacity to act on them given different levels of capital. Doesn't mean culture doesn't matter, it matters to people. And it is that kind of culture of global and local social capital, who you know and how people behave, does matter in reproducing racialized practices. And we think finally it says something about the complexities of class cultures. Yes, there are differences between middle and working class families. Income really does matter, but there are intra-class similarities. That's why I've gone through the third aim so quickly. There are quite a lot of similarities between them. There is variability within class groupings as well, but these class issues always emerge in intersection with the different racial or ethnic groups, and they also emerge in place. So if you're in a low-income family in a low-income neighbourhood with no tuition, that is a different experience to being in a low-income family in a more mixed neighbourhood or in an area that does have a lot of tuition. So your class is also shaped, the way your class identity is understood and experience is also shaped through its emergence in place. So I just returned to my first slide, which was about Claire. Claire did lots of things. We've tried to pick on that as an example of research just because it does intersect with her interests in education. It isn't feminist, I do apologise. I can tell you all the women were driving the children to private tuition. So there is a paper on that side of things that I haven't talked about today. But it does relate to her interest in kind of global mobility and migration and the long-term impacts they can have in different people's lives as well. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Back to the back.
It's more of a comment than a question. Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting. I don't want to sound promote, but just to do a lecture in memory of Claire. Claire and I and Harry wrote a paper on ethnic capital that talks about race and class and education. I thought that might be useful if you haven't written in that paper.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally valid. Other questions? Yeah, Joe.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic. I want to ask about ideological opposition to private schooling versus private tuition. So did you come across families that were like, oh no, I couldn't possibly use private schools, but didn't have a problem with private tuition, or actually ones that just said, well, I would never, you mentioned cost, not that, well, I would never use private tutoring because I wouldn't want to be seen to give my child, or I'm just ideologically opposed to giving my child that advantage.
We talked to lots of parents who said private tuition isn't fair and I'm going to use it.
Are they going to?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that was the point. They were saying the world is not fair. Life isn't fair. Some people are rich, some people are poor, some people are in private schools, some people get into grammar schools, some people are going to schools where attainment isn't as high. Life isn't fair. I'm going to do what I can to help my child. That's all I can do in these circumstances. If you ask me if it's fair, because we did, no, I can't tell you that, but that's not going to stop me using it. So it was an individualized sense of how do I do the best for my child? We did talk to people who weren't using it, who again would say, generally, no, I don't think it's fair. I do think it's an unfair advantage, but oftentimes weren't using it because they couldn't afford it, or because they didn't feel needed it, or they had resources within their family where they didn't have to pay for it because so-and-so, the cousin was doing a maths degree, so he could help. So they didn't need to pay someone to do it because they got social capital that would have covered it. So no, we did not generally find people ideologically who were, against it. And I suppose it's part of a rising tuition market, but we had a lot of people who said, no, it's not fair. There's not a nice message there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. I just wondered, what about the parents who send their children to private schools and also have private tutors?
We haven't done research on them. The reason we didn't at this stage is because we had the stats on private tutoring from the work Sutton Trust had done, and I'd worked with Phil Kirby, who used to work for the Southern Trust and now is at King's as a social justice lecturer. And so we had the stats on what was going on in relation to state schools. So we continued following that through with this. I'd kind of written this grant bid once, not got it, then did some work with Phil, then got it. So it's all like that cycle of how you actually get money to do things. So that's why we work with state kids. But when we've also done work with tutors and done work with the Tutoring Association. And yes, there's a lot of people in private schools who are paying for private schooling and then paying for private tuition on top of it, partly paying to get into the private schools to get as good scores as they can, entrance level, but then just to keep up. That's a significant part of the market. So I would like to do something on it, but we haven't got there yet. I don't know how far it continues through as well. So a lot of the state market is around GCSEs, there's a little bit around A-levels. I've certainly been offered work by the tutoring companies I've talked to do it at university level. And when I said, oh, you can't afford me, they've gone, honestly, we can. So I haven't done it, but there's other processes there. I'd quite like to see it in the elite side of it as well. So it's on the agenda, but it's not been done.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. My question is, was there any element of some informal ways of organizing this tuition? So say community groups, or say people from the community who are university or junior in the offering form of tutoring as a way of overcoming the fact that we can't afford it, or parents and
so the amount people are paying for private tuition varies quite a lot. Some of the people are paying teachers to do this. Other people are using group tuition, and some people are paying students to do this. So it is a very varied market. So I'd say in class terms, there's a big difference between people buying one-to-one tuition and people using tuition centres, which is kind of fill in a booklet and then come back next week and fill in a bit more. And it's not necessarily focused on the individual. When we did work with tutors, we interviewed people varying from people charging about £8 an hour who were also doing free tuition to people who couldn't afford to use it. So they were doing low income tuition and giving away free tuition to people charging, 170 quid an hour. So there's different parts of the market are very different in terms of affordability. And we did find different. We found that tutors ended up serving slightly different parts of the market. So if you were a tutor and you'd got one family in a particular migrant community, you might then find you had lots and lots of families within that migrant community because your tutor got passed around. They weren't necessarily always from that same community themselves, but you kind of got pockets of tuition in that way. But were the people we interviewed doing it, were they doing it as community activism and delivering it for free? No, I'm not saying people don't do that. I'm saying I studied the commercial side of the market. And as I say, the commercial side of the market, the cheapest that got was people charging low rates, but also giving it out for free as a kind of, a commitment to social justice.
Did you get any impression from the people that you interviewed as or insight into why this is increasing so much at the moment, and whether they felt that there was something different about the landscape of education now, or the workforce now, or the impact of the pandemic that meant this was necessary in the last few years where it maybe hadn't been before?
Two things, yes. So one, we asked people if they'd used it, we asked parents if they'd used it as children, and occasionally they had, but mostly they hadn't. So why do you do something now that you didn't do when you were a child? And that is absolutely the changing nature of the job market. So it's partly that you have to have maths and English to get certain kinds of jobs. You can't walk out with no qualifications and go and get a decent wage in a manufacturing economy anymore. So there were people on not very high incomes who were envisaging their children might not be on very high incomes, but now needed qualifications in a way they didn't when they left school. So there was a lot of pressure around that, slightly lower down the attainment spectrum. People were just wanting their kids to get a pass. At higher up the attainment spectrum, it was about competition to get into university, so it was about getting the best grades to get in. So both of those factors, the difference between then and now, the massified higher education, but you must have maths and English, both of those are pushing tuition in a way they haven't done before. In relation to COVID, yes, people were using it to fill in gaps and to fill in holes and to overcome difficulties that children were experiencing. The tutors we interviewed didn't immediately get a splurge of tuition business during lockdowns and things that they thought they would get. So actually the whole market fell off a cliff for them because the exams were cancelled as well, and it's very exam orientated. But then when the schools kind of went back in but were struggling and hadn't taught all the curriculum, then we did see people talking about using private tuition to fill in those holes. So yes, that's had an impact. It's also made it easier because everything went online. So previously it was a lot of labour and a lot of work. And one of the things we started asking people was about the labour and work involved in it, but because a lot of it has moved online, it's become a lot easier to do. So there's less familial labour behind it. You still have to pay for it. You don't necessarily have to drive kids and sit outside and be there for safeguarding.
So you've got a question online from Zoom.
Did you include a consideration of any variable local education policies from the different geography, or maybe there were none?
Hang on, if I press that.
Oh, what do I have to do? Do I have to
I think no speak now.
All right, okay.
I don't know, I'm guessing. Hope Simon's
The
listening.
biggest difference was around grammar schools there. So some regions of the country have grammar schools in and some don't. So where there were grammar schools, there was a lot more 11+ tuition going on. We didn't get no 11+ tuition in non-grammar school areas because people were hoping to go over the boundaries, or people had maybe used it thinking they could do that. But no, the biggest difference was around areas that had grammar school education and those that were going into a comprehensive system. But yes, so no. So that was the only policy difference that really mattered to us.
This is a challenging question because I didn't see it.
Hi, Margaret.
Margaret saying hello. Good, excellent. Simon was listening.
Oh, that is
Magic.
good. Thank you, Simon.
I've got a question, if I can ask one, which is sort of, I mean, I think the question boils down to, does it work? Less, does it work for exams? Not, does it work in terms of getting you the improved qualifications you need? But going back to Bourdieu, is this, you know, in the longer term, do you see this as a socially transformative process, or is it kind of patching up a kind of broken welfare system in the context of structural racism?
See, this is the difficulty. I see it as a socially transformative process in class terms, but not necessarily in a tremendously good way. Going back to what Joe's saying, that this is, and that's why the politics of it is so difficult, actually, because it fundamentally is more available to people who can pay for it, and that gives middle class children another advantage over working class kids. So that is regressive in its form. But, and there's a but around ethnicity. If other people are experiencing things I have right privilege and don't have to experience, am I going to stand here and criticize them for using it? No. And another but is, am I going to stand here and criticize, you know, we interview people who in working class jobs who were paying for their kids to get this because they were desperate for their kids to do better. Now, my son's doing a history NEA at the moment and brought home the question, said, how do you do referencing? Mum, I've got to reference this. I know the answer to that question and I can tell him because I've got the social capital to do that. And if I didn't, I'd be able to find someone. So it's also a kind of ill-behoves me to go, no, you shouldn't have this when I've got other forms of capital that can replace it. So it is socially regressive in many ways, but there are moments where it works for social groups that I'm not a part of, and for individuals it can be transformative. So you can transform the life of an individual whilst having an overall kind of regressive effect on society. And I do think the politics are complicated, and that's why I don't think you have people going, I'm not going to use it. I think you have people going, what do we do here? Because largely people use it when their kids are crying. And I don't know how to do this. They come home with some maths and you look at it. I mean, after about year 6 maths, it's like, and so people don't know what they're doing. And so what they turn to is someone who can help them. So it's got lots of emotions involved in it, as well as politics. And the politics are actually quite complicated as well.
Great, thank you. Margaret's question is now here. Did you find the motivations of different class groups evident in terms of whether tutoring was about class reproduction or class mobility?
That's an interesting question. I think it's definitely about class reproduction in terms of the middle class families we were talking about. It was about making sure their kids were okay. It was about making sure they get into university. It was about how competitive everything is now. So you have to be more able to compete than you used to be able to. So that's about class reproduction. In terms of class mobility, there was a mix, in all honesty. Sometimes people were talking about class mobility. So people were definitely saying, I don't want my children to struggle with money as much as I've done. I want them to be a bit safer and a bit safer than we are. So it's not massive amounts of class mobility they were hoping for. They were just hoping for a bit less precarity than they were experiencing for some people. So some people, it felt like a bit of class mobility, and just actually, if he doesn't get this, he's going to be really in trouble. Like if you don't have maths and English now, what are you going to do? You've got less options. So it's more about not falling in some senses. So that's class reproduction, isn't it, rather than class mobility. So some people, yes, are using it for class mobility, but there's just a lot of fear as well.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to thank you again.